Hi everyone, welcome to Understanding the Journey to the Future State Explained. I'm Kira Di Floriano, the Council's Relationship Manager. So welcome to the virtual classroom. Just to ensure you get the most out of today's call, we ask that you close all other programs, actively participate where you can, utilize the interactive tools. So we will conduct some polls throughout the session. The polls will cast your anonymous vote. The chat function allows you to ask questions, comment, and give advice to your peers. And the raise hand function will let us know if you have a question or comment. Joining us today is Peter Nevin, CIO of the Australian United Brokers and long-standing CIO Executive Council board member. With 25+ years international experience in several CIO roles across multiple industry sectors, Peter has broad experience with acquisitions, turnaround engagements, and startup roles. Thank you for joining us, Peter.
Thank you very much, Kira, and thank you for everybody that's joined us this morning, or whatever time this might be you're listening to this. What we're going to do today is go through a little bit around the evolution of the CIO role, which is one of my favourite topics, because over the years it's been amazing how many times the CIO role has been disappearing, and it hasn't yet. A little bit about the Future State CIO model, which I'll explain more of as we get into it, and from that model then define types of CIOs, and I presume probably an area of interest and perhaps why you're listening to this, some of the competencies that then are relevant to achieving growth within the various types of CIOs. And importantly, we're going to end towards matching how CIOs and organisations fit together, or unfortunately in some cases how they don't fit together. So let's start a little bit with evolution. So I have found it difficult in the past to describe what the evolution of the CIO role is, and I've chosen this model to actually go forward with. First of all, let's talk a little bit about the CIO themselves. So over the years, clearly the technology has changed fairly dramatically. So we've gone from potentially the people who only lived in a black and white world and plugged things into plug boards, right through to super CIO there in the middle, and potentially the unemployment line as well, and lots of difference in between. Top right's one of my favourites. I can remember that period in IT history where one had to sit in a room completely surrounded by clutter, etc. And yet, surprisingly, the things that you did and the services you provide, whilst they were smaller, weren't dramatically different to what a CIO does today. Anyway, moving on a little bit, some of you will have seen this sort of thing before, where human evolution, you take the whole of human evolution and you just try to describe it in 1 hour. So you get things like when the earth crust forms, origin of life, first bacteria, first cells, and you can see moving clockwise around that, humans actually arrive at less than a second before the hour is up. So what I've done is taken that concept, and hopefully that's not too fast in terms of consuming that concept, and talked about the evolution of careers. So let's just think a little bit about careers generally. If you roll into any typical organisation, there are certain things that exist in that organisation. And if we talk about those occurring over the last 5,000 years, and I don't actually believe in Atlantis and those sorts of things, so let's keep it to just the 5,000 years. And let's chart that across an hour as well. So if you start off with when career evolution begins, there's a surprisingly long history of things like medicine, architecture, accounting, even human resources and public sector. And look, part of my hobby is ancient history and Egyptology, and you can see all of those factors actually in an ancient Egyptian civilization. So when someone's an architect, someone has been building buildings for at least 5,000 years. And that profession has developed over those 5,000 years, and it becomes known as a profession. Obviously, probably the one on there that's the most obvious is equally accounting. People are always worried about how many things they've got, whether that's money or sheep, and who's responsible for those, and that's absolutely been around for 5,000 years. In fact, there have been fairly sophisticated accounting techniques literally thousands of years ago. So there's a whole stack of standard professions that live out there. They've developed, there are courses, we know what they are, they're registered bodies that manage those things. And when you go to the doctor, you expect they're an accredited doctor and you know what that profession is. I think you can probably understand where I'm going to go and say that's not true of a CIO or the IT profession, in that it's much, much younger. But let's just start to move around the clock a little bit. So I picked one that's probably more modern. So psychology, first psychology lab, about 1879. So we go from minus 5,000 years ago to 1879. And you can see in terms of the clock, we're right at 59 minutes, 43 seconds. We've already gone right the way around the clock. You can also note there's no IT in there yet. So, first computer bug, discovered by Grace Hopper, 1945. As I'm sure some of you know, the bug was actually a real bug in the back of a computer, a moth in the back of a valve-based computer, which stopped the computer potentially working at that stage. Hopefully I'm already making the point in just how far we are around before we're actually starting to use computing, and how far some of the other professions have progressed in time. First practical computers, you could argue this, but late 50s, very late 50s, early 60s, computers actually starting to be used in business practically, and something we would know as a computer today. 1960, great stuff, COBOL, fabulous language, and we're right up to 1960. In terms of time, we're pretty much running out of time now. So we're 5 seconds almost before. Unix, 1975-ish, and I'm sure some of you will be correcting my dates backwards and forwards depending on which country you've lived in and which documents you've read, but in Australia, that sort of time frame. 1980s is when the first programmer role started to become happening within Australia, and I can unfortunately remember that quite well, because in the public sector at the time, before the 1980s, or really mid-1980s, there were no programmer roles in the public sector. There were business process engineers, there were methods and process people, but they started to become called computer programming roles. So a couple of things there. 1980s is not that long ago, and a wee bit shorter of 5,000 years. First IT managers, you're starting to see first IT managers called that late 80s, early 90s. And certainly in Australia, the CIO role started to become known in the mid-1990s. So really where I'm trying to get to, and I'm sure you've all got there before I have, it's absolutely no surprise that this role is evolving, changing. We constantly are talking about, is there a different role? Should it be called Digital Transformation Officer? Should it be Chief Innovation Officer? Are there different, is security now coming to the fore, and does the CSO start to interrupt and change? And yet, despite all of those things, if you roll back even to the IT manager and through what a true CIO does, that activity in an organisation still exists to this day, and I suspect will exist for quite some time, regardless of the name. So let's talk a little bit about what a CIO's role is. And this is my take on it, and I'm sure other people will have different versions of this thing, but in terms of what makes up IT in an organisation, there's some bottom level in terms of, and what I tend to call plumbing, basic hygiene. PCs on desks, printers, phones, it's a service, it's a utility, it's like your phone, it must work, and there are methods of actually providing those things. And the beauty is today, clearly, that includes mobile devices and internet access and all those goodies. Sitting on top of that are a few things that sit in that environment that make life worth living, and I clearly need to update this slide, but email, Office, anything that you use on a mobile device, Facebook, LinkedIn, all of those sorts of goodies that actually make some use out of that utilitarian thing that you have. So moving up the stack in terms of any organisation that you're likely to work in, there are a standard number of systems that exist. And no matter what organisation you work in, there's got to be HR, payroll, accounts, things that actually make the organisation work. And it doesn't matter whether they're outsourced, whether you're a small organisation, whatever. They can be big, they can be large, but they must exist because you employ human beings, you pay human beings, you have to have some sort of an accounting system in place to keep track of the number of sheep you've got, and et cetera, et cetera. And it might move up the stack a little bit in terms of content management or document management or something like that. So some repository to keep unstructured data in the organisation. Starting to get a little bit more exciting. Now this depends what you do and what not what you do, but what your organisation does. So if you're in a manufacturing organisation, it's the systems that wrap around the manufacturing system. So it might be an ERP with MRP, and I'm going to sound like an alphabet here in terms of the way your products are produced and the way you interface then with the suppliers of parts, etc. for that. Or if you're more in knowledge or a finance system, in the banking system, it's literally the banking systems that support the back end of keeping track of, again, how many sheep an individual has in their account, right through to inventory, sales, stock keeping, etc. So it's the things that make the company do what the company does and produces the product. And on top of that, I call them customer-facing systems. There's lots of other ways of talking about this, but it's the bits that make and work with the outside world. So clearly it's the website, it's the way you take payments, it's the way you sell the product. If you're someone like Uber, it's a massive part of the overall organisation. It's interesting, Uber still has all of those layers below it. It's just the ratios of the way those things exist. Okay, so turns out business value is pretty much in that direction. The higher you get up, the more business value you get out of those things. And what's interesting if you start to group them together is those bottom two, no matter how good you achieve things in there, the best you can ever achieve is reducing the cost of IT. Or you might be able to improve the reliability, and one offsets the other. You're never going to change the world. The best you're ever going to do is reduce your IT cost. Moving up a little bit, transformational change in these areas, the best you will do is reduce the cost of running that particular business. So this is different to changing the revenue, etc. It's the cost of the business, it's not the cost of IT. Where it gets exciting is the top here. It's where you change the business. So this is the business strategic side of things, and this is where you can increase profit, you achieve business transformation. It's strategically different to the bottom layers. So hopefully you get a feel for reduced IT cost, reduced cost of running business, changing the business at the top level. So CIO's role over time in each one of those. So let's start off here. So CIOs initially began in this particular area. So it's something like an improved accounting system, maybe a booking system for airlines, something along those lines. And we're back in about the 1960s, and I've used the CIO role very loosely there. Over time, as PCs became more available, mini computers, etc., the CIO role actually expanded and started now to cover all of those systems. And that was both a headache and a beauty, because the headache side of it is now I have a whole heap of other devices to actually deal with and manage and maintain security and governance across those. The joy of it is then the actual access that individuals had to the value that IT provides. And we very much see, I guess, a resurgence down in that bottom layer in terms of mobile devices today. And certainly from the 1990s onwards, and this is the upswing that I need you to understand, that this is the difference between an IT manager and a CIO. The CIO is then responsible for making in an organisation the production systems work, the customer-facing systems work, and establishing the strategy, etc. of those things. And as I've said before, the business value is absolutely in that direction. And I'll just add very quickly on the top of this, things that we call digital transformation today tend to live in that top area, but never forget they're very difficult areas to support unless they've got some foundation from the production systems and the back office systems. It's very valid today to go into an organization and be digitally disruptive, which is not too easy to say, and actually just start at that customer front end, significantly change it, improve it, and improve the organization. There's a however coming. If you don't link back to those initial foundations, over time that initial blush of achieving outcome starts to actually be demolished as you try to maintain those systems over time. So, whoops, one too many there. So very quickly, it's kind of interesting. This is a quote from Sir Ralph Norris. For those of you who don't know him, he was CEO of Combank up to 2011, has a very illustrious career. And some of his comments, this is out of an Australian Institute of Company Directors magazine, many boards do not have sufficient capacity to understand how technology works. We need to see more technology executives gain general management, moving into the boardroom. The reason I brought that out is if you think of the CIO role and you think of a board, on boards there are loads of accounting skills, and those accounting skills that come through CFO roles. We as a profession need to make sure that that is true for technology with on boards. Okay, so moving along a little bit, let's talk about the Future State model. So Future State model was developed by CIO Executive Council and effectively by a very large number of CIOs in the US that contributed to this. So these were very large organizations, Chevron, Thomson Reuters, H&R Block, Glasgow Klein Smith, etc. And they came up with this rather complex looking diagram, and hopefully I can make it a lot less complex for you and explain just how that model works. So the model talks to three types of CIOs. So if we take the layer across the bottom there, the first layer and the first archetype of CIO is an operational or functional head. So as the words say there, that individual runs the IT organization. They achieve, and this is important, IT operational excellence, effective, reliable IT in the company. And I think you can probably start to imagine now as I'm talking about this, the previous slide I gave in the various layers, how that might fit in relation to the layers. The next one up here is transformational leader. So they work with the organization, they achieve substantial change in the organization, enterprise-wide change. They reduce silos, they make organizations potentially work across country boundaries, and they do that in somewhere between a good and a bad way. The top level, however, then is, as I was explaining before, the business strategist, the potentially outward-facing CIO, and this again is where digital disruption lives, being able to take the technology, the underpinning steps there, so the green and the blue bits that they've already achieved in their organization, and somehow then modify the way the organization provides its services, its product, its whatever to its clients, the way it interacts with its clients, and potentially change and provide a different company strategic direction. So,
Peter, I might open up one of the polls before you get into the next slide. We just would like to get an idea. So just of the three leadership types, we want to know what the audience most identifies with. So what leader type do you most identify with? Are you more of a functional, a transformational, a business strategist, or do you find that you're split across the three? Sorry, just bear with me a second while I... Okay, yep, great. So everyone's voting.
Brilliant. Well, please feel free to keep voting, and that's excellent. So I'm seeing functional there seems to be winning at the moment. Oh, no. Yep, functional is definitely winning at the moment. That's quite tragic, really. Let's see how that goes anyway, and we'll come back to that in just a second. Oh, okay, this is all very exciting technology, so we're actually sharing the poll, are we?
Sorry, I'm trying to. Sorry, it doesn't seem to be working.
No problems at all.
So what we
can just talk to that. So where we are at the moment, we've got 29% functional, 29% transformational, and pretty much 0 business strategist. And that's probably not overly surprising. So I'll push forward a little bit, and we might come back to that in a sec. So this next slide shows on the left-hand side is the amount of time a CIO spends in any one of those areas. And the point worth making, and this may change your response in terms of the answers you've just given, no one lives in any 3 of those areas uniquely. And yes, it would be lovely to live in the purple area, the business strategist, your entire life. It doesn't work that way. So if you look at the bottom scale in terms of different CIOs, if we talk about where CIOs are currently and where they may be in the future, some years ago the CIO Council predicted that trend to move to the right. And I'd have to say that was going very accurately and quite correctly. However, there was this little thing called the GFC which put a bit of a hint knock in it. So if you see there through to 2013, so the next slide I've just shown is the number of CIOs on each one of those. You'll see on 2013 that the operational was starting to peg down, transformational was coming up, business strategist, yeah, coming up, coming down, etc. But I think what we're seeing is because there was a tightening of funds, companies tend to then go back to an operational sense, and that tends to be reflected in the CIO world. The other thing that's changed and removed the business strategy side coming up is that concept of a digital transformation officer. And I think over time you might see some of those roles rolling back into the actual role of the CIO. So moving forward, what are some of the drivers of change? And I will go through these reasonably quickly. So I'm sure you've seen number 1 a million times before. IT's commoditized, there is a plumbing component, and there are pretty straightforward ways of making that bottom layer work. Cloud, everything around cloud, loads of providers out there, still need to manage them, but that's an interesting exercise. Millennials, in terms of the way new employees are coming into the workforce and viewing the way the environment needs to be provided. Double-edged sword, millennials tend to be looking for innovation, etc., and yet in some cases not accepting of change quite as much, and in some cases very much tied to the technology that they have grown up with, as opposed to, in some cases, the previous generation that's seen very rapid changes in technology. Ubiquitous data, so data across the world, basically, big data. Social, interacting with the marketing channels, so what was the CMO and the relationship, so Chief Marketing Officer, and the relationship between the CIO and the CMO. And of course, big data then providing value. So moving on, and I'm sure you'd be interested in terms of competencies and the way your skills, your competencies may then lay the foundation for moving across and moving into those areas. So this diagram's laid out in terms of competencies on the left-hand side and how those competencies then achieve an outcome, on the right-hand side. So let's talk about the competencies. These competencies were developed by Egon Zehnder. Some of you may know that name, a very large recruitment HR organization out of the US and indeed internationally, enormous in size. And they went through and laid out a series of 9 competencies, and they benchmarked those competencies against all C-levels roles in organizations. And they did that for many thousands of C-levels. So C, I don't mean as in water, I mean as in chief. So let's talk through those quickly. They're reasonably obvious. Strategic orientation, I think what the words say. Team leadership, again, commercial orientation, so business versus strategy. External customer focus, knowing what your organisation does externally. Collaborating, how do you get on with people? How do you make things happen? Influencing. What's your knowledge of the market that you work in, or markets? How do you deal with change? People and organisational development, so the more complex side of leadership and developing and growing individuals. And how do you get results in your organisation? Now, what was really interesting as they went through in the US and assessed a whole stack of CIOs and CEOs, you end up with a nice little spider graph like this, which lays out each of those competencies. And you can see there the CEO is the blue marks and the CIO is the red mark. And there's a really interesting thing which, for those of you who have CIO roles will understand, you pretty much need to understand the business, everything that works in the business, and in some cases you need to do that as well as the CEO. So what it's saying there is there's a pretty damn close match, except for the marketing knowledge of the organisation. And I'm sure you will find CIOs now where that gap is closing considerably. So it's a very interesting take on what makes a competent CIO.
Okay, we're gonna try and open up the polls again, see if we can display them properly this time. So we were just interested to see which core competencies do you think need the most development? So we've grouped them together just in relation to those three CIO types. So you've got commercial orientation, external customer focus, and market knowledge, strategic orientation, change leadership, collaboration and influence, and results orientation, or people and org development and team leadership. I'll just give everyone a couple of seconds just to choose. So it looks like we're on about 86% for strategic change and collaboration, which is at that transformational level, 71% for commercial, external, and market knowledge, which is at that business strategist level, and then 29 for the people and org development and the team leadership, so at that functional level.
That's a very interesting result, and the reason that's interesting, if I can move on to the next slide, is looking at the way those individual competencies then break out and are the main drivers for the types of CIOs. And bear in mind they're cumulative, you can't just have one of these areas. So within the operational role, the competencies that are most important: team leadership, people and org, functional expertise, which when you think about what it is, you're running IT, there's a fair chance you need to know how to run IT. Transformational leader, so as well as the ones I've just covered, you need strategic orientation, collaboration, change leadership, and results orientation. Then moving further up, in terms of business strategist, you need commercial orientation, external customer focus, and market knowledge. So it's interesting, our results sort of map across the three of those as well. So let's talk a little bit about the types of CIOs. And I want to concentrate on this middle area here, and in particular, run through each of the various stages and how they work. So functional stage CIOs, bottom level CIO we're talking about, their leadership focus. Their leadership focus, not surprisingly, is internal, inside the organisation. So they optimise operations within IT, they make IT work well, they ensure people that are around them actually have good functional competencies. The way they manage their staff, teams with good skills. Now, really important to understand, none of these are minor achievements. So at this level, you expect your ITIL or your processes to be running well, your PMO to be running well. It's providing good IT within an organisation. Stakeholder relationships, not all that shabby. They meet, they have quick wins, they run IT like a business. In terms of the reputation of IT at this point, hopefully you're getting a feel for the way this graphic now works. So how is IT considered? Credible. So what credible looks like is it works efficiently, it works effectively, there's decent security, there's decent management. And I think you can understand now why many organisations are still in this stage. This is quite a competent and reasonable way for IT to be working in an organisation, depending on what type of company you have. So transformational, moving up the scale and doing exactly the same thing. So looking at the leader focus within that. Leader focus is now across the entire enterprise. They're not focused within IT, they're across the entire enterprise. As you can imagine, they're trying to defeat silos across the organisation. They're putting an emphasis on collaboration, change management, seeing IT strategy really be called IT strategy or integrated with the company strategy as a whole. Their staff expertise, you're expecting to see business analysts, people within the group that have a good understanding of the way the company works as a whole. You might even see the IT group embedding the IT managers within business units, much more outsourcing potentially, and much deeper leadership skills happening within the organisation, within the staff that are within the IT group. Stakeholder relationships, now considered a partner. So you're not a service provider, you're actually part of the business, you're actually a partner. You can measure this by involvement in business committees, business-related IT metrics, etc. So how's IT known at this stage? Influential. So you're seeing optimized business processes, globalization, enterprise agility. If you recall the stages I was going through here you're reducing the cost of doing business, not the cost of IT. Okay, the much more exciting one. So let's move right away to the top. CIO strategist. Okay, our leadership focus now is external. So that's talking about knowing the market, knowing the competition, knowing how you work, how you, the company, works in the marketplace. Emphasis on commercial orientation. You know how to talk about business. You know what an EBIT is. You know what EBITDA is. You know what how business works in financial and commercial senses. The staff expertise that you see within the so-called IT group is business related. So they've delegated operation and functional oversight potentially outside the organisation. Very much customer-facing IT structures. So the IT is aligned along whatever the geography or nature of the customer. So it's by customer grouping, it's by geography, it's by product line, however you're aligned with the customers. You're rotating leaders through the business. You're actually seeing true career development for the individuals in IT. Stakeholder relationship, I don't need to say much more, it's a peer. So you're no longer even the partner, you're absolutely integrated into the business. You're collaborating on business strategy, you know you're part of the business strategy process, you cultivate a board relationship, the board trusts you at this point. IT, game changer. This is where you're now influencing the outcome of the business. You're achieving business innovation in concert with the rest of the business. You're not doing it by yourself, you're a peer of the business. You're achieving competitive advantage, which didn't previously exist. And because of the way data is occurring and the intelligence you're deriving from the data, you're allowing the organisation to make good business intelligence decisions. So how do you get there? It's not really like winning lotto. Unfortunately, it is a career and potentially a good part of a lifetime in terms of a career. So there ain't, that I know of, any real quick way of doing this. However, there are absolute measures of how to get here. So let's take each one of these. Leadership focus. So if you think about the stages of leadership focus, you're trying to take the way you lead a group of people from internal IT to right across the enterprise without silos to external. So how does one do that? My favourite, you provide transparency. Part of the thing I've done throughout my career a number of times is interim roles where I've gone into an organisation where, for whatever reason, the CIO and the company have decided to not work with one another anymore. And inevitably, a big step where, if anything's gone wrong, it is that no one knows what IT does, no one knows how it's spent, where it's spent, why it's spent, who's prioritising. Transparency and getting prioritisation to occur outside the IT group, absolutely important. Getting IT part of the customer interaction as you're thinking about processes, innovation, etc. Think about the way you interact with the customer. Obviously, almost goes without saying, you need to know about your company's market and truly how your consumers use your product. Be very cautious with mergers and acquisitions in new environments. If you're finding out about that afterwards, you have a problem. You need to try and get in front of that curve, and that's a very difficult thing to do, but trying to find out about acquisitions, being part of the due diligence, being part of the business case, absolutely essential. And have a business focus in terms of what you do. Boards like to talk about company risk. CEOs like to talk about bottom line, EBIT, and the services or products we provide. Have the same view. Staff expertise. So these are the staff that work for you. And if you're seeing these things, it reflects what you're doing well with leadership. So staff expertise moves from internal systems to business processes, right way across the organisation to the business itself. So the sorts of things you're trying to do is have an IT leadership tier with business and technology skills separated. Import senior IT leadership. Link competencies to leadership positions. And this is a tool you can use straight away today, is have a look at those 9 competencies. If you have people reporting to you, those competencies move up and down the stack quite well. Trying to understand the person that works for you or within your team, how do they need those competencies, and it immediately gives you some ability to produce a development plan for that individual, or even have the discussion in terms of where their career is going. On-job training, that probably goes without saying, and that may be limited by the organisation you're in, but there's nothing to stop agitating for exactly that. Mentors from within the business, absolutely. Can't overemphasize this. Double-edged, triple-edged sword. If you're having trouble with someone at a senior level, finding someone else that you can talk to about that at a similar senior level and trying to use that individual as a mentor is fabulous. Obviously, there are other advantages of mentors in terms of you see someone successful, how did they get there, why did they get there, and you take away the valuable items that that person can give you. Involve staff in education, the organisation wider, etc. 2 ways of doing that. You can bring people into IT, get some senior people to sit on the service desk is always good for a laugh, or vice versa. Try and get some of the service desk people, and next time you're having a quite serious executive meeting, ask them to come along and listen and expose people to the processes in both directions. And for you personally, if you can start to become involved in non-IT related programs in the organisation. As this role and as your people, you need to give confidence that you know how change works in the organisation. And having and mastering change leadership and giving that confidence outwardly is an integral part of the process. Stakeholder relations. So you've gone from service provider to being a partner to being a peer. CIOs sometimes come from a technology background. It's important that you speak the English speaker, not the technology. You've got to explain terms. Seek support from other business leaders. Befriend the CFO, befriend the CEO. Find someone at an executive level that you can actually get support from. Try and get an understanding in the organisation that solutions can create market value. Identify neglected systems, deal with them, don't leave them on the shelf. And as always, stakeholder perceptions vary. There is no one solution that fits everybody. Okay, so we're just about through where we need to be. So just quickly in terms of some fairly obvious ones, at any time in any organisation, an organisation needs a CIO at a particular level, and that varies depending on the maturity of the organisation, how long they've been in business, what they're doing at that particular instance in time. One of two things can happen, or three things can happen. They can employ someone who's not good enough on the left-hand side, an underdeveloped CIO. That individual is more comfortable outside the business strategy area, and inevitably over time, unless that individual develops very quickly, there probably will be a disappointing event. Also, what's very frequent is that the CIO comes in and finds out that they thought they were coming in as a strategist and they actually need to go and do some of the technology side. I'd say to you, you'll hit the right-hand side probably more often than the left-hand side in your career. Be prepared to go and work with the company and move the CIO needed to the right rather than leave the organisation. And many times I've been in exactly that role. So how those mismatches work. So one example is that the operational CIO is focused down there, the company in a whole is focused out there, and it doesn't really work. And then reversing that process, CEO in the business is worried about their PC not working, and the CIO is up here, and that is a deadly combination. There have been a very large number of CIOs over the years who've left organisations based on effectively some part of the infrastructure not working, and eventually people saying the mechanical stuff's just not good enough, CIO doesn't cut it. So never underestimate that stuff. So let's just run through a little bit of summary on the back of this as we're getting towards the finishing stages here. So bear in mind, CIO role is constantly changing. You as an individual in that role and your team need to adapt and be proactive in that changing process. Don't be concerned if a concept of a digital transformation officer comes in, a chief marketing officer. Learn to live with it and move forward. We talked about the leadership journey, internal, enterprise-wise, external. We talked about staff expertise, how you develop your staff, where they're focused. Systems, business processes, the business. We talked about stakeholder interaction and how that works, and you can measure how things are going by the way where you fit within those steps within that stakeholder. And perhaps one of the most important ones, the mismatch element that I mentioned at the back. Always match your skills with the requirements of the organisation, and importantly, the way you apply those skills. And I guess if none of that works, just try being so good they really can't ignore you. That's all I had to run through formally. The next slide I've got is an amount of resources, and I might hand back to Kara at this point. So thank you very much, everybody.
That's great. Thanks, Peter, and thanks for taking us through that journey. If anyone has any questions or comments, if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute your line and you can have a chat to Peter, or you can submit questions via the questions option in the webinar. But I'll give everyone a minute or so to kind of digest and see if they do have questions. Peter, I just want to go back to those the poll that we conducted about the 3 CIO leadership types and what people most identified with. So we actually had 29 at functional, 29 at business strategist, and then I think we had 43 that saw themselves split across the 3. And I think that's quite common, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. So I probably didn't emphasize adequately the level of if you're the business strategist, you still need to do the other 2 roles. There is no role where one exists in isolation, and if there is, well, clearly that's a nirvana type role. So that's not overly surprising, and that actually is quite good that people are seeing themselves split across all 3.
Absolutely.
And if you recall the graph there, it's actually saying, hey, over time, you need to work in all 3 areas.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, it doesn't look like we have any questions. think that means you were very thorough.
Hopefully, yeah. Hopefully I haven't set everybody to sleep.
No, that was great. Thanks for taking us through that, Peter. And everyone, I'll send through the recording if there's anything you want to reference again in Peter's presentation. Take a look at those additional resources. And if you haven't taken the Journey to the Future State Self and 360-degree assessment, I strongly suggest doing so. I think it's a great benchmark tool, even just for your own personal ongoing learning and development. But thanks everyone for attending, and again, thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks, Kira.
Bye-bye.